I'm sure if you're new to the subculture, you probably have noticed that goths can be passionate to the point of where it can come off kind of near gatekeepery. And I wanted to touch on that because I know oftentimes things can get very muddled or misconstrued when you're in that situation, like you're a baby bat, or if you're someone that's kind of interested in the subculture and you're kind of met with kind of side eyes or like skeptical glances. And why are we like this? And particularly, why am I like this? If you've been with me from the beginning, you know that I came in hot, and for good reason. We all can be very passionate when it comes to really protecting the things that, you know, preserve the subculture and keep it, just maintain it, keep it going and that kind of thing. But for me particularly, why am I like this? Some of you may know, some of you may not. I come from a very unstable background, home life, childhood, what have you, but I digress. The subculture has very much been a home for me, and anybody involved in music-based subcultures, music in itself is healing. It's therapy, and for me it was very much those things. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about kind of the dynamics of the subculture and why that kind of gatekeepery, pedantic demeanor when it comes to certain things might come across that way. And hopefully you'll understand that it's more of a language and maybe not feel so attacked. I know, because a lot of people do. And I know a lot of times the way that I've come across in many videos, I can get so passionate when it comes to things. But when it comes to the subculture, and I see people trying to alter it, change it in ways that are not organic or authentic, kind of bastardizing it, I get mad. And I know a lot of people do. And sometimes there are better ways to explain it, but then other times you just need to instead drive it home with a jackhammer. And sometimes I do. To me, the goth scene was very much an awakening. And in it, I found myself, truly. It wasn't one of those superficial rebellion situations where you fall into a group of miscreants because instability begets delinquency. We're here to vandalize your cemetery with our carefully crafted picnics that we clean up after, and sometimes leave flowers for your relatives who've had to put up with our quiet charcuterie and contemplation. I say this because there are people on the outside that tend to believe that alternative subcultures are born of instability and broken homes. And some might look at me and my background and say, well, case in point. No, I'm a goth who grew up in an unstable and oftentimes very dangerous environment. I'm not a goth because I grew up in a very unstable and dangerous environment. So the two really do need to be separated, just so that kind of misconception doesn't get thrown out there. Just because that was my background doesn't have anything to do with my subcultural affiliation or the music I listen to or anything like that. But it does make me a hell of a lot more aggro when people come in and try to muck with it, which I'm sure you've seen. I found a group of people and an aesthetic that I didn't know existed, but the moment I saw it, everything just kind of clicked and fell into place like it was always part of me. It was always there, just kind of waiting to be activated. In the 90s and in the wake of that whole satanic panic thing, it really didn't take much to be seen as a freak. The bar was very, very low. And since that bar was so low and so little had to be done to be seen in such a way, particularly, you know, you can just don an all-black outfit, that's why I think that the 90s were a very much overlooked decade when it came to the subculture. And it was something that I found when I came back to the goth scene and I discovered the scene through the eyes of YouTube. And when doing so, I found that the only really, the only semblance of anything really truly authentic really wasn't touching on anything involving the 90s. It was almost as if the 90s didn't exist at all. And it was the 80s, which is now referred to as trad, or really the only kind of goth there is. A lot of people truly believe that. So it's either trad or now. And there really was no in between. I don't know if we can really count like the early 2000s because that's when things tanked. We'll talk about that later. But the 90s were always very much overlooked, and that was my coming of age. That was when I found goth. That was kind of my era. And some of the best music came out of that decade. Some of the best fashion came out of that decade. And nobody was talking about it. Nobody knew about it. And I kind of took it upon myself to say, okay, well, somebody's got to do it. So that's, you know, why I got established here and started really talking about the 90s, what it was all about. And come to find, so many of my 90s family are here, have been here all along. And it's, you know, it's great to kind of, it's great to reminisce, and it's great to kind of see a resurgence of a lot of things. And it's great to see a lot of these bands coming back. Corpus Selecti, hello. Autumn, who also came back. Sunshine Blind. William Faith still making music, and you know, he's always been a very incredible musician, a huge part of the subculture. And it's great to see so many of the old schoolers, you know, the OGs, still there doing their thing. It warms my heart. I'll just put it that way. So when it comes to things like the very subdued kind of appearance and aesthetic of the 90s, it is very much, I guess, laid back when compared to, you know, our 80s predecessors. Don't get me wrong, that 80s look definitely carried over into the 90s, and we all paid homage. Every now and again, we would call it either old school goth or we would call it punky goth in appearance. And when it came to aesthetic, we never stuck to one thing. And I noticed that that's a thing nowadays. People are more, I'm trad goth, or I'm romantic goth, I'm new goth, I'm pastel goth. And they will pick that one aesthetic and they will stick to it. Like that is their thing, and that is kind of, and it's also ingrained in their identity, which is weird to me because it's always been you're goth or you're not. Goth is goth. And when it comes to your appearance, you kind of went with what felt natural for you that day. Like, you know what? I feel like dressing in all PVC. I'm going to wear head to toe PVC. Or I really want to wear a velvet Renaissance gown today. I'm feeling very Lisa Hammer, or I'm feeling very Monica Richards. And you would do that. You would sometimes, you would be listening to a lot of Virgin Prunes or 45 Grave, and you'd be like, you know what? I'm going old school today. And it was not an uncommon thing. And people didn't look at you and say, oh God, you poser. You're supposed to pick something and stick with it. A lot of people are searching for themselves and doing so in ways to where they further break themselves down into these really intricate categories, but then putting the word goth on the end of it to kind of describe what type of goth they are. But here's the thing, once you're in the scene, you found your niche. That's it. You know, you don't need to add all of these different titles to yourself to fit in or find you or be you. You are who you are. You're in the goth scene, and you have freedom within the scene. You can wear whatever you want so long as you're listening to the music. So there's always that confusion there. So I think a lot of that kind of temperament and that mentality with a lot of the new generation tends to worry a lot of the old schoolers, because it's that kind of thing where it introduces the element of fashion goths, and it's people who view goth as more of an aesthetic more than anything else, and they'll even go as far as to call themselves goth. And you know, there's nothing wrong with calling yourself goth if you are, which by definition means you listen to the music. It's a music-based subculture. And the thing is, goths don't really care if you dress goth yourself and you don't listen to the music. There's nothing wrong with that. Fashion is a very subjective thing. It's an art form. You do you. You dress how you want. However, once you start calling yourself goth, you kind of got to put up or shut up, because if you're not listening to the music, that's when the that mentality comes out where people are like, hey, wait a minute. So if you want to mitigate that, at least try. Just give the music a try. Just have a listen. Ask a goth. They're happy to share music, always, which is more than I can say when I was younger, because people hoarded music as if it were this sacred thing. They're like Gollum with the ring. It's like precious, and they would not let you anywhere near it. That was people in my school. However, it was a little bit different in the clubs. I just remember in my school, the Goths, when you heard something new, they were happy to show you something on tape and have you listen to it. And then you say, this is great, what is this? And they'd be like, I don't reveal my sources. I hated when they did that. So talking about the fashion, the 90s really brought with it, you know, kind of a departure from that punk mentality, and it was more of a romantic approach. So you tended to see a lot of period looks. You have Renaissance gowns, you would have corsetry, poet blouses, these big alchemy pendants, and like, you know, the alchemy rings, the armor rings. I loved those. I had one and it broke. It might have been a knockoff though, I don't remember. With that look, it created a very memorable environment. And part of that environment came the soundtrack. It's this comfort, and it's just, you feel it. And I'm one of those people where I love lyrics, but I can kind of disappear into a melody just as easily, sometimes more so, than words themselves. And when you have something like that, it's captivating, it's cathartic, it enriched me in ways that I otherwise wouldn't have in the environment that I was in. And for those moments that these songs played in my new dark and beautiful surroundings, for those moments, I wasn't that scared, paranoid, jaded kid that was scared to go home. I was me. So as a kid, I grew up with rock, punk, new wave, and here's a fun fact. In the 80s, if you are accompanied by a parent can bring a kid at any age to any club or any concert. This is a true story, because my mother took full advantage of that, and she would dress me up, spray the hair with, you remember that like spray? I think you still get it for Halloween, like the neon hairspray where it just colors your hair. And she would take me to clubs, and I remember she used to take me to this one kind of like punk slash new wave club. I don't know how they combine the two, but it was like this club in our town, and it was in the 80s. So I can technically say that I clubbed in the 80s. And the one thing that I remember is a lot of hair. We had that big hair and angular makeup, eyes and, you know, cheeks that just disappeared up into the hairline, and loud, loud blazers with shoulder pads just squared off. Reminded me very much of a flock of seagulls, now that I think about it. I think in people's lives there are varying things that a person could be interested in that kind of all suit a certain kind of template, that are on a path, and at the end of that path is the subculture. So even as a kid, if you're interested in certain things, you know, you're kind of gravitating toward it here and there, and you're just, as you're going through life, going further and further down the path, and then at the end you find the goth subculture, and it kind of seems like, you know, life and circumstances were kind of leading me there all along. As a kid, I was intrigued by the paranormal. I loved Halloween way more than Christmas, and it's still the thing for me to this day. It's like my serotonin button. I was always very musically inclined. We had like this Casio keyboard that landed in my house somehow from like Toys R Us in the 80s. It was definitely not a gift for myself or my sister. I just remember this Casio keyboard, and if I heard a song and I held it in my head, I could always play it by ear. I've always been able to do that, and as a kid, that was kind of my thing. I liked dark things. I mean, I hated horror films, but I did love Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. She was just the right amount of non-threatening for an anxious little kid. I can say with absolute certainty that goth has saved me. It's where I found myself, and I found the music that became incredibly sacred to me. As a baby bat discovering this new world for the very first time, I wanted to share it with everybody. Any alternative person of any variety, any open-minded normie, you have to come with me to this place where the music and the people are like nothing you've ever seen. Obviously I've calmed down a lot. And a lot of it was because people on the outside, they tended to not understand alternative subcultures. They would look at anyone, you know, wearing anything remotely black and assume that that person listened to death metal. They assumed anybody that was alternative listened to death metal, and we were all kind of part of the same thing. And it felt really important to me to make that distinction for other people, so other people know no, this is goth, this is something different. And I felt it was really integral for them to hear the music so they can also make that, once again, distinction. And I'm not saying anything bad about death metal, just that they're not the same. However, the old school goths at the clubs were, they're very much different mentality. They were either indifferent or what you would consider some variety of gatekeeper. The kind that I spoke of previously, you know, how to survive a goth inquisition. And some of them did it, you know, because they were jerks. Some of them were honestly just jerks, and then others were a little bit more protective. And I realize now that they really had to be. What they were doing is they were protecting their home and the very thing that they love from becoming bastardized. Much of the things that stood to threaten the scene at the time are basically the same as the things that stand to threaten it today. It's just back then it was much easier to mitigate, and that thing is people. People that wanted to come in and change the subculture into things to suit them more because they liked the idea of it. It was either normies that became tired of their own spaces because they got bored and just wanted to, you know, put on some black clothes and dance with the freaks for a night, or other people who would draw on their faces and wear dog collars and felt entitled to goth spaces. Manta Knights. So the Manta Knights were they were the pains in the asses that thrived on negative attention, and they did everything they could to make sure that they got it. Screaming, trying to mosh to new wave, dumping their water bottles out on the dance floor, which is a hazard in itself. You've seen our shoes. The normie group, on the other hand, was just there to kind of do something different, but be that as it may, they both kind of presented the same kind of problem. At some point in the night, they would get bored, they get to be in their bonnet about not knowing any of the music that they were listening to, nothing that the DJs were spinning, and they would want to hear their own music, whatever top 40 dance chart hits that the normies were listening to, or Slipknot, or something of the like, neither of which any of the DJs are going to play. And if enough people come and they're persistent enough, they're going to get frustrated, which they did, and they would kind of take it out on other people, and they would take it out on the environment. So it's that desire to kind of come into a space that's not yours and try to change it. And that's really what a lot of us have often tried to just protect it from. But this is why the old schoolers of the 90s clubs that I observed were a lot more on the stern side of things. They were serious about protecting their home from basically being taken over and made a spectacle of. And eventually it happened. Around 2003, 2004, you had the house clubs and raves. They started emptying out into the goth nights, which was very bizarre. You'd see it kind of bleeding into it, and soon we were hearing a lot more EBM music at our nights. Then we had day glow clad go-go dancers dancing along with like glow sticks to the EBM music, and some just straight up house music. And this was the Bat Cave, so this was not on brand, and it was very weird, and it was very frustrating. And the it got to the point where you'd be hard pressed to hear anything goth, and the closest thing you'd get to it was like Division or Wolfsheim. Goths were inevitably pushed out of the very venues and the very spaces that they helped to create. Probably 2005, when it tanked. Why are we like this? We are so damn passionate about the subculture, about the music, about the authenticity, about keeping it alive, because this is our home. And we know exactly what happens when people on the outside take an interest in only the superficial aspects or the idea of it, with no real interest in any other parts whatsoever. They treat it like a trend. By trying to drive out the music, it's like a stake through the heart. It's how you kill it. We've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. And now, with social media at the helm, driving goth into the mainstream, we kind of have to be a little bit more militant about it. A lot has changed over the years. So nowadays, when a person makes the effort to show up, They're attending the clubs, they're attending the shows, they're supporting the Knights. Golden. You're not going to be questioned. Nobody's going to give you that inquisition that we got way back when. However, when it comes to online spaces, if you find yourself met with possible skepticism about your presence there, or, you know, just questioned in online spaces, I'm not saying it will happen, but if it does, please understand, it's not you personally. It's like that saying that teachers used to say in school when we wanted to do something that we were always able to do, but now suddenly we're not allowed to do it anymore because a bunch of kids did something stupid. Is a few bad apples spoil a barrel. We had bad apples, so people are a lot more protective now. Not taking it personally is so much easier said than done, but try and understand that, again, in online spaces, it's so much harder to suss out the genuine versus the ill-intentioned when you can't see them. So the best advice that I could possibly give is just understand that that's what's going on, and you genuinely have nothing to worry about if you're there for the right reasons. You know, obviously if you're there to find a goth girlfriend, you'll find out what happens. But again, what it all boils down to is that when something means so much to you, you're going to want to protect it. And I think that you'll probably, as a baby bat, you'll find yourself in the same position one day.